Hi, Professor Charlie Evans here. This morning I'd like to talk a little bit about ancient Rome. This is actually the sixth time now that I've tried to record some comments about ancient Rome. The problem is that ancient Rome covers such a long period of time. There's so much to talk about, it's hard to figure out what to focus on. I took a moment and scattered down some notes that I could start with. And the first thing I would like to bring your attention to is the length of time that is involved when we're talking about Roman history. If we go to the traditional founding of the city of Rome in 753 to 509, the expulsion of the last Etruscan king of the city, to the beginning of the Roman Empire with Julius Caesar in 45 BCE, to the end of the Western Roman Empire in 476, the 5th century, to the end of the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire in 1453. We're talking about an enormous span of time. That's like 2,000 years, and it's hard to get a grasp on the continuity that went on for Roman society and Roman culture over that period of time, while at the same time the differences and the changes that occurred. So we're dealing with 2,000 years of history. That's an enormous period of time, and understandably, the Roman civilization had an enormous impact on all the areas encompassed by Rome at its height. And you see Rome at its height extends from northern England around the entire Mediterranean basin, North Africa, Egypt, the Near East, Asia Minor, most of Eastern Europe, France, Spain, Portugal, all part of the Roman Empire at its very height. And so you can understand that all of those present day territories have some sort of cultural heritage dating back to the Roman Empire. Now, typically, when we talk about Roman history, we divide it into the Roman Republic. The Roman Republic, really, from the origins, and I'm going to date it to Julius Caesar becoming dictator and imperator of Rome in 45 BCE, and then the empire from that point in time, 45 BCE, until the final end of the Western Empire in 476. So you have the Republic, the first part, the empire, the second part. At the same time, you should remember that Rome was a republic the entire span of time. Technically, it was a republic. Even though later emperors fashioned in an functioned in an autocratic fashion, they were still part of the republic framework. Uh, the monarchy was ended very early on, and so the entire span of time, Rome was a republic, a democracy. Now, something to consider. Uh, Given the map that we saw of the extent of the empire and the impact of the empire, it's kind of interesting that the political heritage of the idea of the republic really disappears from Western Civ, and it's really only in the 18th century with the creation of the United States that we really have the first large-scale republic appearing in Western Civ. Now, all right, there are some minor things along the way that we could say, but really the whole idea of the republic, the lack of a king, disappears from Western Civ, even though the Roman Empire was such a big influence on Western Civ. And so I mentioned Julius Caesar. Everybody reads about Julius Caesar in Shakespeare in high school, or whatever. Caesar is really the demarcation point between the Republic and the Empire, because by the end of the Republic, the political mechanism in the Republic, the Senate, the carrying out of the affairs of government had really begun to break down, largely as a result of social tension between the very wealthy, who became wealthier and wealthier and wealthier as the Republic expanded across the Mediterranean, and the lower classes who didn't enjoy the wealth that flowed back to Rome. And so by the end of the Republic in the first century CE, there was a series of civil wars. There was widespread civil unrest as um, as Rome tried to come to grips with how to continue the Republic, but at the same time have a fair mechanism for all the classes to participate in the wealth and expansion of the Republic. Now, one of the key features of the creation of the empire was that from the very beginning of Rome, from the 6th century BCE, the city expanded. One war after another, first across the Italian peninsula, then through North Africa, then through Greece and Asia Minor, the Near East, Gaul, Spain, all became part of the empire as a result of the military expansion. I found this interesting illustration. I found this illustration on the web. It shows the typical weaponry of a legionnaire, a Roman soldier. The Romans were fanatical about their military. They were extremely disciplined. They fought largely with the javelin and the short sword. But because of their discipline and everything, they were able to defeat any enemy that really, because of their discipline, they were almost always victorious in battle over their enemies. It wasn't really until the first century of the Common Era, first century CE, that the Roman legion first was defeated in battle, and this was by barbarians, so to speak, in Germany. One of the kind of offshoots of the continual military expansion and the reliance on the military in Roman society, of course, we all know, was the gladiatorial games. And here we see an image of what remains of the Colosseum, which was the premier gladiatorial site in Rome. The gladiatorial contests, from what we understand, really began in the early 3rd century BCE, largely as a funeral custom, where slaves would fight to the death over the graves of their masters. Now that's really a great way to go. But that also brings to mind that because Rome continually expanded as a result of military conquest, that brought a continual influx of slaves into the economy. And so increasingly, as Rome expanded, as wealth flowed back into Rome, it was slaves that really were the backbone of the Roman economy. They worked on the large plantations that developed, the large latifundia. And when Roman expansion began to break down in the 2nd and really by the 3rd century of the Common Era, and the supply of slaves began to diminish, that really just began to destroy the Roman economy. Because if you didn't have slaves, which cost basically nothing for their owners, the economy could no longer function, because now you had to pay people to do that work, and then you didn't have enough people to do the work. So back to the Colosseum, the gladiatorial games began as this kind of funerary custom. Increasingly, politicians began to put the games on as kind of a campaign promise to entertain the people who would vote for their campaign and to become more prominent and get publicity. And Julius Caesar was one who used the gladiatorial games as he tried to get more support for himself. And then gradually they expanded, and gradually the Romans built these large colosseums so that they had places to hold the games. By the 2nd century of the Common Era, the games were huge. They were almost a constant feature of Roman life. They were always going on. The Romans, of course, became very innovative in the kind of games that they held, the kind of different weapons that were in the arena, the kind of animals that were used, the kind of matchups between different kind of gladiators, different kind of animals, or even innocent victims that were used. They had all kinds of innovations, and you can read about that. There's a number of books, and of course you can watch some Hollywood movies about that. Rome itself, the city, at its height was a huge metropolis. You're looking at a scale model that was created about the city to kind of give you some idea of what the city looked like. And of course, the two most prominent features here are the Circus Maximus, where the chariot races took place, and then the Colosseum also. But the Romans were master builders. They built enormous public structures, temples, government buildings, aqueducts, the Colosseum, and a lot of the buildings survive to today. Of course, a lot of the buildings don't survive because they were repurposed over the centuries as later inhabitants tore down the buildings and used the marble and other stones for other kinds of different building projects and everything. But at its height, Rome itself was a huge metropolis, millions of people living there. And you get some idea of kind of the scale of the city in just this small picture of its model. So Rome didn't last, even though parts of it lasted for 2,000 years, parts of it didn't last. And so by essentially the 5th century, Rome had disintegrated in the Western Mediterranean, in what is now Western Europe, largely as a result of the barbarian incursions, largely a result as the spread of Christianity kind of changed the spirit of Roman citizens away from the focus on their city life and civic duty to their inner spiritual fulfillment through Christianity. So you had Christianity, the barbarians, you had a series of diseases and plagues that wiped out millions of people in Rome. You had the decline of military expansion. You no longer had the influx of slaves to run the economy. And so a variety of factors contributed to the gradual decline of Rome, the decline of the Roman spirit and everything. But one kind of thing that kind of lived on after Rome was this kind of idea of unity, that there existed a unity of Europeans, of the Mediterranean, and that somehow Rome had created a supra-state, a large state that combined all these different cultures into one unity. And the clearest example of that, of course, is the European Union. This idea that there is such a thing as Europe, and this kind of like harkens back to the Roman idea of this kind of the Roman Empire, the Roman unity, and everything. So those are some ideas about Roman history. You can read about it in your textbook. There's a lot of information in a textbook. You can read about it in all kinds of history books. There's literally probably millions of pages written about Roman history. And so you can find some of that and have a look and see what you think. Okay, thanks. Bye.